Namaskar, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I'm Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. The foreign ministers of the QUAD grouping of India, the United States, Australia and Japan vowed to work vigorously to achieve the grouping's shared vision of a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific and collectively deal with common threats like terrorism. At the QUAD foreign ministers meeting in Melbourne on Friday, External Affairs Minister S Jaishankar, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Japanese Foreign Minister Yoshimasa Hayashi and Australia's Marise Payne reaffirmed their support to principles of openness, protection of national sovereignty and observance of rules and fair play. They also denounced the use of terrorist proxies for cross-border terrorism, urging countries to work together to eliminate terrorist safe havens, disrupt terrorist networks, infrastructure and also the financial channels that sustain them. So discussions centered around issues of cooperation in the Indo-Pacific and the progress made so far, as well as current geopolitical events. To put things into perspective on the crucial meeting and vision of the QUAD grouping, I am joined on the program today by an eminent panel of experts. So let me begin the program first by introducing them to you. I have with me former Ambassador Navdeep Sarna. Good evening, sir, and thank you for joining us on the program. Dr. Sriram Cholia is a foreign affairs expert. Thank you, Dr. Cholia, for joining us on this edition of Perspective. And from Washington, D.C., joining me is Ms. Elizabeth Braw, Resident Fellow, American Enterprise Institute. Ms. Braw, thank you and welcome to Sansad TV. Dr. Cholia, let me begin the program today with you first by understanding what, according to you, were the key highlights of the QUAD foreign ministers meeting. Very, very crucial one, given the current geopolitical events.
Very much so, Tina. I think, first of all, it reaffirmed from the rest of the partners the faith in the US that the US had not forgotten the Indo-Pacific because of the ongoing tensions with Russia over Ukraine and over the security architecture in Europe. There was a concern in our region that maybe the US was being drawn away again into other theaters. Yes. It has happened in the past, a kind of a grand strategic diversion. So the QUAD ministerial reaffirms that faith that the US has not abandoned this region, and certainly it cannot afford to do so. And they're showing it in the form of Secretary of State Antony Blinken coming all the way to Australia. I think if you see the ministerial outcome at the end of it, it was quite strong in language. The word that stood out and which many have picked up is coercion. So they made a very clear, challenge to Chinese coercion and Chinese hegemony and expansionism in the region. And from time to time, this must be in the international discourse. And I think these kind of ministerials and of course the summits, we have had QUAD summits. It's become a new trend now, and there's going to be one more. So those will, reinforce that message that there is a problem in Asia. There's a problem of imbalance and of unlawful and aggressive conduct by a kind of a preponderantly powerful country. Mm-hmm. And that must be stopped in its tracks. And I think so that kind of messaging has gone out, and that's good. A lot of nitty-gritty items were also discussed across the range of topics for cooperation, like you have COVID-19 vaccines. Already QUAD have committed to it. The infrastructure projects, they haven't gotten off as much as we would have liked them to be, but there is a plan for a QUAD Build Back Better for the world kind
Absolutely.
of initiative.
And these are issues, and the kind of progress that we have made on this front is something that I'll discuss in the course of the program. Let me get in a word from Ms. Braw, and very, very significant one, because there was a sense here in this region that the United States, because of the crisis at the Ukraine border, the ongoing tension with Russia, the United States is being drawn away from the Indo-Pacific region. That reaffirmation, Dr. Cholia says, has been made with the presence of the US Secretary of State at the meeting in Melbourne on Friday. What, according to you, Ms. Braw, would be the key moments from the meeting of the foreign ministers of the QUAD grouping, which you think sort of nudge the QUAD in a closer embrace?
Who was it that said that 90% of success is showing up, and Secretary Blinken showed up, which I think highlights and really stresses not just to the Asia-Pacific region, but to the whole world, how important this region is for the US. And as you said, there was some doubt that Secretary Blinken would go because there is a quite significant security crisis in Europe. But he went anyway, which sends an enormously powerful message. And at the end of the day, I think that's what people will take away. Yes, they will look at what the minister said, but the most important thing is that even though there is an extremely severe security crisis in Europe, maybe it's certainly the most severe crisis that has taken place there for a couple of decades, that even so, the US is maintaining its focus on the Asia-Pacific region, particularly because, of course, as we are all aware, China is becoming more assertive, not just militarily, but economically as well. And these are three fantastic partners America has in the region, and with whom it can build some sort of framework to assert the international rules-based order, such as it is, and try to create some sort of more stable, some sort of stability or increase stability in the region. And we should also remember that this is something that affects the current behavior by China is something that affects not just countries, but companies as well. The whole way our globalization is set up.
Okay. Ambassador, how do you see the foreign ministers' meeting of the Quad grouping advance the grouping's agenda, the ambitious agenda to say?
Yes, I think as the previous speakers have already said, that they've underlined the importance of the meeting. I think as far as I see it in terms of what you're asking now, I think it's an important step which carries forth the momentum of the last year or so, which has built up in the Quad. It's been a graded process. We started with heads of divisions meetings, and then we moved on to foreign minister meetings and virtual meetings, and then we had 2 leaders meetings in 2021. And slowly the agenda has become more and more substantive. And I think if you read this joint statement, you see a considerable expansion in detail on the various issues and what is going to be happening. So in very significant terms, it takes forward what was decided by the leaders and is seen in the leaders' joint statement of September in Washington, D.C., as well as in the fact sheet that was issued. I think the important thing is that while the working groups, say in emerging technologies, in supply chains, and others are getting down to work, we don't sort of lose sight of the broad principles. And I think the broad principles that have been again reiterated are that this is it's a force for global good, the Quad. So it's a positive agenda. Yes, the shorthand and the subtext is to counter China's influence and to counter the method of China exerting its influence in the Indo-Pacific. At the same time, I think what has to be contributed is a positive agenda. So you will see a lot of references to positive agenda, practical implementation. So, whether it's in terms of critical technologies, it's terms of, how the multilateral economic system has to work, how the UN law of the sea has to be implemented. Everywhere there is a stress on how things can be taken forward in a practical form. And at the same time, you will notice that, there is the continuous use of the term inclusive. So you're not making an exclusive club, but you're setting up an inclusive sort of grouping in which other countries, as long as they play the game, can come and ultimately, theoretically, be part of it. And the other aspect which you see very strongly underlined is the centrality and the unity of the ASEAN. So the Quad is not there to subvert the ASEAN. The Quad is there to support the ASEAN. I think these are elements which have come forth in this joint statement. And of course, they haven't gone into too much detail as to what the working groups are doing, but that gets an impetus once the foreign ministers meet and subsequently, presumably, the leaders meet.
Dr. Chalia, in terms of supporting the ASEAN, what are the steps that have been taken by the 4-country grouping in recent years?
Well, Tina, one thing is that the Quad Ministerial talked about deepening the cooperation with regional partners. And when they say regional partners, they obviously ASEAN is the most important of them all.
Yes.
And if you look at the building blocks, it's Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines. These are the three countries with whom the Chinese have territorial disputes and who have faced the heat in the South China Sea and beyond, and who have been looking for external support to be able to hold their own against the Chinese juggernaut. So definitely more military exercises, more joint actions we are doing bilaterally with the ASEAN countries, because ASEAN countries are wary of being seen to be joining the Quad. They don't want to be formally part of Quad, but there are other means by which we are doing it. Apart from that, even smaller island nations, for example, the ministerial was talking about humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Now, Dr. Jaishankar just tweeted that we have supplied COVID-19 relief medical supplies to the tiny island of Kiribati, which is one of those very small Pacific Island countries, via Australian cooperation. Same thing we are doing with Japan. Together, we are trying to build ports and infrastructure in the Indian Ocean countries like Sri Lanka, Maldives, Myanmar. So what I'm trying to say is that this kind of pairing up with key countries in the region, meeting their practical needs, as Ambassador Sarna is saying, yes, and offering a what we call diversification, meaning these countries should not be in a kind of a debt trap for China and should not become de facto colonies of China. That is the real fear. So I think to push that back, we are taking many concrete initiatives in third countries, meaning Quad countries in other partner countries, and sometimes in a group. Sometimes, for example, the Pacific Islands is an entire grouping, and they have been facing a lot of pressure from China. There is even talk of fishing. Where does fishing come into Quad? That's because the Chinese trawlers, deep motorized trawlers, are completely devastating the coasts of many countries and are depleting the reserves and not even caring about the livelihood of farmers from those small countries in the region. So there is we have mapped out the threats. We have mapped out the major threats to defense and military and national security. That's one. And then there are the human security issues, human development issues, health care, all these things, and telecommunications, 5G rollout. There is going to be a Quad initiative to provide alternatives. So if you add up all that, we've got the strategy. Only thing is attention, strategic attention, and resources need to be put in. I just want to mention one thing about Australia. They hosted it. They were so grateful that all the remaining 3 foreign ministers came. Why? Because they are facing tremendous economic coercion from China. Since Australia raised the issue of the origins of COVID-19, the Chinese have been so nasty to Australia. They have imposed a blanket, economic boycott and have hurt Australian exporters. So how did Quad come in? Quad countries offered to buy more Australian wine, more Australian agriculture products, and so on and so forth, which the Chinese were blocking and imposing tariffs and barriers. So this is how we help each other. If we have a national security crisis, the remaining 4 Quad countries should come to our assistance. If the Australians are under coercion, the remaining should come and show us, not just solidarity in terms of words, but through actual policies. I think that's what now we are able to do. And surely the Chinese are worried about this. They may sound nonchalant, or they say they don't care about Quad or so on, but they're paying attention. And I can tell you that they are hot under the collar. They are not liking it.
Absolutely. And each time there's a Quad meeting, there's a very, very strong reaction coming in from China as well. Even yesterday, we saw a very strong remark and, of course, a rebuttal as well from Dr. Jaishankar. Ambassador Sarna, coming back to you to understand, because these were obviously issues of cooperation and economic partnership that Dr. Cholia pointed out. But apart from the areas of convergence, what was rare in the Quad meeting in Melbourne on Friday was there was just joint media address, and on which there were some areas, particularly global issues, on which there were also divergence, especially if we talk about the Russia-Ukraine standoff, on Myanmar. So there was clear divergence among the 4 countries. Do you see that impacting the functioning and in future, the longer durability, the sustainability of the Quad, going forth, the challenges that the grouping has to face?
No, to the contrary, I think it's good that the institution gets clarity, or it's not really an institution, the grouping gets clarity that you can't agree on everything to the same extent. So I think that has been something, even, let's face it, even on China. I mean, China doesn't get mentioned in any of the statements. It's all shorthand. Why is it shorthand? Because some countries may be more willing than others to actually start blaming China by name. So this grouping has to work on the issues on which it can work to the extent in which it can work together. And that's why its evolution has been gradual. Why did Quad 1 fail about 12 or 13 years ago? It failed because the countries were not on the same page, essentially on China. I mean, the Australia-China relationship at that time was, going great guns. So obviously that couldn't work together, and we were on a different page. The US was on a different page. So clearly, I think it's important that the grouping knows the limits on which it can make common pronouncements. And obviously, it was clear that they could only go that far on Myanmar. They could only go that far on Ukraine in the press interaction. Mm-hmm. And I think the Foreign Minister of India made it clear why, what our position was on different things. So I think there will always be daylight on certain issues between the four countries. But that doesn't take away from the grouping. I mean, this is a bespoke grouping. It's not something cast in stone that on everything you have to agree. It's not a treaty-bound organization. Mm-hmm. This is a bespoke grouping for particular purposes coming together. And I think that will be the reality of Quad. If you try to overload it, if you try to enforce a kind of unity of vision on everything, then I'm afraid you'll start seeing cracks.
Okay, Ms. Bra, but the assertion coming in from the US Secretary of State that whatever happens in Russia-Ukraine crisis is going to have an impact across the world, and expecting India, of course, to also have a stand on that issue and not maintain a neutral stand. But India's assertion that, and what has been highlighted by Ambassador Sarna as well, that the Quad is based on this principle that it is for something but not against someone. How is it being read in the US?
So it's being read as a force for good, for what it is. It's as the ambassador pointed out, it's not a political and monetary union. It's simply a cooperation tool for four countries. And we should remember, for those of us wishing that the Quad would be more and would be more institutionalized, we should remember that even the European Union started small. It started as a coal and steel community with a very small number of countries. Then it grew a little bit, and then a little bit more, and then it became the European Community, focused on the common market. Then it became the European Union with a more powerful parliament, with a more powerful executive, and I think, and I'm not predicting that the Quad will turn into an Indo-Pacific European Union, but we should just remember that even the most formalized institutions, organizations, started small simply because, as the ambassador pointed out, if you overload them right at the beginning, then they will collapse, and we're all worse off as a result.
Okay, Dr. Cholia, so we've discussed about what happened at the meeting, but largely talking about the grouping and its future. What are the kind of challenges, particularly coming from China's hegemonic designs, the challenges that this grouping faces, and how do you look at its future?
Well, I think main thing, Tina, is to manage the expectations. I mean, some people, the so-called Asian NATO idea, I mean, we cannot go that far. I mean, many of us are wary of entering into alliance type of, formal treaty alliance type of relationship. So, and then the other is the economic, interdependence of many countries across the Indo-Pacific with China. So that kind of makes it a lot harder because the smaller countries do want an alternative and they're looking for alternatives. So providing economic, framework that can be like a choice. I mean, if you are one of the small countries in the region, let's say you're Laos or Cambodia, I mean, historically, you've been, in the Chinese pockets. What do you do? What do Quad do? I mean, Myanmar is the biggest case, right? I mean, we all say that we want democracy and the Quad is underpinned by democratic values. but to what extent we should support restoration of democracy there, and how do we do it? There will be differences like you mentioned. So I think North Korea, apparently the Quad, all four agreed because Japan wants it. North Korea was condemned and its ballistic missile tests were condemned. India wants to bring terrorism into the picture, like you said at the beginning, although the other countries seem to be somewhat less concerned about it, especially Australia and Japan. But nonetheless, there is a problem of jihadist groups in the region. In Indonesia, for example, in the Philippines, we have had a resurgence of ISIS mentality and ISIS affiliated groups and Al-Qaeda type of organizations. So we do need to keep an eye on all this. So I think main thing is to show presence, especially maritime presence, combined maritime presence. And second, I believe, like I said before, joint works and public works and projects, but that is where the Chinese are far ahead of us. Even all four of us put together cannot match the kind of infrastructure projects that the Chinese have been operating through the Belt and Road Initiative. So President Biden spoke about the Build Back Better for the World, B3W, and there is a version of it for the Indo-Pacific. We need to strengthen that. We need to tie up with the Europeans also, because they are big investors in the region, and jointly do a lot of projects. My view is, you can only keep a country like Sri Lanka or Myanmar or Laos in a balance if we are able to also put up the money and say we are also willing to finance a power project or a dam or a bridge. Mm-hmm. And that's where the Chinese have an advantage. So I think we must focus on infrastructure, and that will be a big challenge. The vaccine response has been great, and I think that's one more area where we are doing better than the Chinese. The Chinese dumped hundreds of millions of their vaccines in this whole region and beyond. They were totally wasteful because they did not protect anybody. The Chinese vaccines have very low efficacy, but Indian-made vaccines with with Western cooperation have been far more successful. So I think we have to, muscle our way in through these kind of creative interventions to make this whole region believe and have hope that Quad is something that is good for us. It is, like Ambassador said, a force for good, which Absolutely. Will balance and give more options and freedom to all these countries in the region. It's not just freedom of navigation. I would say freedom of foreign policy choices. That's what Quad should provide for everyone.
Absolutely, and become a force for global good. That India keeps reiterating. Ambassador, one final question to you. When we talk about challenges and concerns, some of the analysts have also pointed out that although India has engaged in cooperation and different kinds of partnerships with countries in the region in the form of bilaterals, multilaterals, but we lack a coherent Indo-Pacific strategy. How valid is that concern? And do we actually need to sort of revise the Indo-Pacific strategy if we are to actually make the Indo-Pacific grouping into a force for global good?
I don't know where this comes from, because as far as I've seen it, I think it's a fairly consistent growth in terms of India's policy looking east. I mean, we started with Look East more than 20 years ago, or about 20 years ago, and then it has moved into, Act East and so on. And I think we've had a fairly progressive relationship with the ASEAN. At the same time, we've had we had different sort of pillars of our policy. We had Sagar, and we had, looking at the Indian Ocean region. And what we are doing today is sort of meshing all of these together into a broader approach to the Indo-Pacific as the concept itself has evolved. From a merely a military construct, which the US had. In terms of its PACOM and Asia-Pacific region. And now the world is seeing it not just as a security zone, but an economic zone, a people-to-people zone, HADR zone and technology zone. So I think we are sort of evolving our policy as it happens. Yes, it's not one big policy that has descended from somewhere, but I think if you look at the last 20 years of our interaction with East Africa, with Indian Ocean states, with Pacific Island states, and with the ASEAN as well as our neighborhood, all of this gets combined today in what you're seeing as the Indo-Pacific vision or the policy, which was defined by the Prime Minister at Shangri-La. And then it has sort of evolved as we have gone along into the nitty-gritty, both with ASEAN Quad and other sub-regional and regional organizations. So I don't really see scope for an unnecessary criticism here. One can always criticize. There's enough creative ability to do that, no matter what the subject. But I think if you actually see, there has been a very gradual and a fairly, up-to-date evolution of our policy on the Indo-Pacific.
Absolutely, and the trust that it is an inclusive policy that India is always, looking towards when it comes to Indo-Pacific. So inviting Russia and China also to be part of this shared resource. So I think with that, I'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of Perspective. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program today, sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers. So that's it from us on this edition of Perspective today. Thanks very much to all our viewers as well for their time.